Um, but they have led me into a more intimate state of listening and even more intimate sense of, I think the really important voices out there are the voices that have dealt with this on the front lines for years, for decades. One of the things that I found most informative was about a week ago or so. I think Oprah Winfrey got a collection of sort of Black leaders. Some of them were clergy, some of them was a professor, and a few different people. And just getting their reflections on what the country was going through, what their experience was, their reflections on the whole terrible and tragic situation with George Floyd. And as I listened to them, I found that there was some that were just, I was really taken aback in a good way and really felt like these are the voices. Some of these people had the voices that I think were so important to hear, that these voices that had been working in the trenches right there in the midst of this for many, many years, for decades, that it was part of their calling. The calling of their life was a calling to give voice to give voice to these racial tensions, for lack of a better word, in our culture. And some of them were, I found, to be inspiring and inspired with a kind of creative vision. And there were many other things that I've listened to and over the weeks. And I find that my own ear and my own heart is inclined to those really experienced voices that are inspired, and that this is their life's work. Because I think this kind of issue, it really needs to be voiced, it needs to be articulated by people who have made it their life's work, who have been called, you might say, as my very religious grandfather would say, it's important to be true to one's calling. And so I've listened for the voices that feel like they're truly called. And the voices that have vision, real vision. I think in the modern times, when there's so many voices, so many ways of connection, of outreach, of being able to articulate one's point of view, one's voice, that it can be challenging to find the really deeply wise voices, the people with gravitas, with life experience, with calling, with inspiration, with vision. I remember one Black minister I heard, and this is such a simple thing, but I thought it was so important, and that he's saying that he thought that a crucial step was being able to turn protest into policy. It's a simple thing to say, sometimes when you hear something and you go, yeah, that's simple, but it encapsulates something so important, because events like we witnessed, and not only this latest tragedy and death, but a whole history of tragic, unnecessary, unjustified deaths. This is the latest version in a long, long history of these kind of things. And I think it deserves and really requires that this outrage, I think, that many, many people feel. You know, you can't watch a video like many of us watched without feeling a sense of heartbreaking outrage. And yet I think that outrage needs direction, needs focus, needs envisioning, needs to be channeled and turned into something that will have and can have great impact. That's my hope, that that can happen. And so part of my reflecting on all this and my sort of waiting, my patience to sit here and talk with you or anybody really very much, especially in a public way, was realizing that one of the things I think that I tend to be relatively good at is knowing what I don't know. I think it's a really important thing in life to kind of know what we don't know, or to know what we're good at, to know what we're not good at. Another way of putting it might be to know where our calling lies, also. And I see that this situation calls for much more experienced voices than mine. It calls for those who are called in a really deep and profound way, in a very experienced way, and I hope in even an inspired way, to shape and give form to the kind of transformation that we need. Not only transformation of policy, and whether it's governmental policy with police reform, and all these things that are I think very, very important. I think it is important that the protest can turn into policy changes, and that's where you and I all, at the very, very least, and I do mean at the very least, that I think it calls us at that level to really pay attention and to use one of the greatest powers for change that we have, which is the power of our vote, and to use that power, each of us individually, to use that power for the very best we can to actually support those who really do have a vision for real change, and also, I think this whole issue also calls for a change of heart, and I think that also goes into where I've been called into this sort of listening, because the more I listen, the more my heart sort of opens, and not only opens but gets informed, right? Gets informed, receives perspectives that I didn't have, and I find that as I receive more, that my heart not only opens, but it also grows. It grows in magnitude, I guess you might say. And I think that's important. The change of heart to go along with the change of policy. These aren't easy issues. I think we all know that. They aren't easy issues. There's not going to be a wand that's waved that's going to correct all this, that's going to change all the policy and transform the human heart into something more open and unified. And this is a life's work. This is real stuff. This is the nitty-gritty of what it is to be human. We've been dealing with this in this country alone, like I said, for the better part of 400 years. And to come back to the contemplative dimension to this. I remember over the years, really as long as I've been teaching, which is close to 25 years now, almost as long as I've been teaching, I've heard people say, well, you know, what the world needs is just to have like everybody spiritually awaken to their true nature, and somehow that's going to resolve all the great issues of humanity. Number one, I've heard it many times, people suggest that we're on the cusp of such an awakening, which, by the way, I don't see evidence of. Sorry to disappoint some of you. I hope I'm wrong, by the way. I deeply hope I'm wrong about that. I want to be wrong about that. But I do think it's easy to think that we're in, you know, a sort of wave of a kind of transformation. But sometimes we have to realize that there may be a wave of transformation, but it may be a wave in a very small part of our world, or a little pocket over there, or a pocket over there, or a pocket over there. I don't even think that spiritual awakening would resolve all of the human problems. I think human life is much more complex than that. Spiritual awakening, enlightenment itself, it doesn't even solve all the problems of a particular human being, of the human being who's experienced that. It doesn't confer any kind of perfection. It doesn't even confer any kind of great capacity to relate well or to not be deceived in certain ways. It's one of the great dangers of awakening itself, is the awakening can come with a sense of overconfidence, a kind of unintended hubris can take over. And that's not an insignificant risk in the kind of teaching work that I do. You know, it's also a risk to think that awakening is just simply what the whole world needs. Personally, I would settle for the world growing up quite a bit, you know, to have a bit more mature, open-minded, open-hearted egos would go an extraordinarily long way towards all manner of human transformation, societal transformation. I do think that spiritual awakening, if it's authentic and deep and profound, is anybody that's really has ever had it feels that it is sort of the most profound experience, of transformative experience of their lifetime. And so I obviously see it as extraordinarily pivotal and an important piece, a huge piece of the puzzle of human happiness and human suffering and many, many other things. But I've always viewed even the whole teachings of awakening with a certain sort of sobriety. It's part of the puzzle. It's a piece of the puzzle. It's a big piece of the puzzle, but it's not the whole puzzle. The contemplative dimension, of which so much of my teaching is oriented towards, it's a piece of the puzzle. It's not the whole puzzle. The whole puzzle takes many, 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 many people, you know, millions of people really living out their inspired, open-minded, open-hearted vision for the very best of humanity. It takes the contemplatives, it takes the activists, it takes the inspired politician, it takes the inspired spiritual teacher, it takes the inspired environmentalist, it takes the inspired business person, it takes the inspired mother and father and grandfather and grandmother, and it takes so many different forms. I do think that in large part we do sort of come into this life with sort of basic orientation. I think part of the inner work is is awakening, yes, but it's also a discovery of what that inner orientation is, part of what our own individual calling is. A calling in the way that I'm talking about it isn't something that comes from our ego. It's not something we create. It's not something that we do as a means of justifying our life or making ourselves happy or gaining power or prestige or influence. That a real calling comes from a different place within us. The ego, you could say, receives the calling, but it is not the place from which the calling comes. And I think when we see people of great calling, we feel that they are buoyed, they are lifted, they are sustained by something greater than their individual self. As a young boy, I could see this, I could feel this when I would watch someone like Martin Luther King give a speech. It was so clear that this was a human being of calling, of inspiration, of profound intelligence, of nitty-gritty life experience, of a huge heart and a brilliant mind and a calling that was bigger than him. He was embodying the calling that he was given. And I've seen that in different people throughout my lifetime, people that are sort of living their calling. You know, most people's callings, it's not a public thing. It can be very quiet. It can seem almost concealed. And yet, when it's authentic, when it's real, it carries a kind of, it carries the presence of something that's bigger than the individual, but wanting to be embodied and lived out through the individual. And so I'm very clear on what my calling has always been. Like I said, I'm a contemplative at heart, a contemplative with great concern, however, about the human condition, about the great challenges of racism, the great challenges of our, we have so many immense existential challenges, in the environment, global warming, kind of somewhat broken political system, poverty. We rarely hear in our national politics much about poverty. We hear a lot about the middle class. But talking about poverty is not a big part of our political discourse these days. So there's all these different dimensions. And right now, obviously, we also have this great challenge of the COVID virus. And I think it's challenging. It's challenging to be a human being right now. It's always been challenging. But we are dealing with issues now that feel existential in nature. Our forefathers and mothers weren't thinking about that we could destroy the earth to the point that it might not support us anymore. That wasn't really a whole lot of their concern until relatively recently. That's an existential challenge, and we were confronted with lots of big challenges. Right now we have all those challenges are there. And now we have the most current, most obvious challenge of the coronavirus, and now the coming to the surface in a public sense, never gone away, but public sense of the sort of great racial tensions that we have in this country. And one of the things I think about is I hope that people don't sort of get like challenge fatigue, where the heart starts to close and the mind starts to enclose into its own little place, because it's all just too much, because it's all just overwhelming. Even before the last 4 or 5 months, I've noticed for years people were already in the place of so many immense challenges that we face, so much need for deep and systemic transformation, not only inside of ourselves, in our hearts, in our minds, but in our societies as well, with each other as well. These are big issues. It's a time of really, really big issues, really, really important issues, and it calls upon a real deep sort of human resiliency. I do think one of the benefits of a deep spiritual practice is that if it's done well, it can really build a kind of resiliency where we can lean into greater and greater challenges and keep our hearts open and keep our minds open, and not to go into overwhelm or into depression or meaninglessness, or just be swept away entirely by anxiety. That one of the real benefits of deep contemplative practice is it does exercise the muscle of resiliency, emotional, psychological, mental resiliency. And I think that's really needed now, in these times where we're all sort of asked, even demanded, to kind of lean in, and not close ourselves off, and be willing to have our minds changed, and be willing to have our hearts changed. So specifically, with the subject of this talk, with the racial tensions, like I've said, right now, I'm predominantly in a place of receiving, of a more intimate engagement, an intimate listening to different voices. I also discern the voices, the points of view that I listen to. Like I said, I really listen for the ones that I think have real transformational value, that have a real healthy vision, a real way forward. I'm reminded today and recently of this very famous, I'm sure we've all heard it. I want to read it to get the quote correct, because it deserves to be correct. It came from one of the great speeches of Martin Luther King. And he said, "I look forward to the day when we can judge people not by the color of the skin, but by the content of their character." That's a very poetic and inspired and beautiful thing to say, and it has a real reality to it. It's a vision. It's a North Star. It's a direction. It's because I do think we need these sort of North Stars. We need to focus whether it's our outrage or our disappointment or our however you respond to it, whether it's anxiety or depression or defensiveness or whatever it is, but we do need North Stars. We need something to focus all that human intensity, so we know where we're going, so we know what the end point is or what the goal is. Not that we probably ever fully and completely arrive. But I have seen, certainly in inner work, in spiritual work, that intention is pivotal, absolutely crucial. That's why I actually put it as sort of the number one principle of my whole teaching, is to have sort of a great clarity about your intention, about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and where you're headed. Because without that, our energy gets dissipated in all these different ways. And so we do need intention. And so that's what I'm listening for. That's what I'm listening for, is the voices that really can articulate, can give direction to all this emotion, to this great challenge, to those of us who really do want to have our eyes continued to be opened, right, and to this entire issue, but opened for a reason, opened so that we can, in our own ways, participate in that vision, in where we're going, in that endpoint. And that's one of the things I loved about that very famous quote: when we can judge people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.